Hello everyone and welcome to Fuse Room. I'm Alberto. In this video we're going to talk about IVORY5 limiter by Acustica Audio. Now this unit looks to me as if it was heavily inspired by the Maslek MPL2, which is an analog peak limiter, and it's quite fascinating that we finally have a digital plugin that aims to emulate an analog peak limiter. The digital limiters, the brick walls that we're used to use, have the capability of looking at the future and predicting with the famous look ahead function what's coming at them. So if there's a heavy transient or there's something that needs a little bit of a different approach, they're always going to be prepared to process that part at the best of their possibilities, something that an analog limiter just cannot do by definition. The beauty of it, however, is that they have a very beautiful sound, and the engineers who designed them meant every single piece of the path for the signal to be that way. So these units are very sought after, especially when you're mixing or mastering something that is 100% acoustic, and it's a great tool to have. The main problem with the hardware unit, and I'm thinking with the plugin itself, is that it's a little bit cryptic to understand. A lot of people have found it too difficult, have tried and fiddled with the knobs, didn't quite get the sound they were expecting, and kind of ditched the unit. This happened for the hardware units as well. Now, in this video, I'm going to tell you how I do it. I learned this from the best mentors out there. I had two people that I was super lucky to work with who are masters of the MPL2. And I think that if we use this approach that I've learned with the IVORY5 limiter, we're gonna nail it down. I propose we take a look at the plugin from a technical standpoint first, and then we put it into action. So the interface is quite simple and resembles the hardware unit quite a lot. On the left part of the interface, you have a preamplifier button to engage it or disengage it, and an input trim to create more or less preamp saturation. On the rightmost side, you have the output trim and the HF on, which is quite peculiar to this unit. Whenever the HF on is disengaged, this unit will work in wideband. So the leftmost part of the center area, LF threshold and LF level, are actually the wideband. So this is a more traditional kind of approach. The whole spectrum of frequencies is handled by the threshold, which is a way to get closer to the limiting factor. And then you have an LF level, which trims the actual level. So what you would normally do with a single stage would be to increase the threshold until you see some gain reduction. At that point, you know you're peak limiting, and then you can counteract that with the LF level to, compensate the gain reduction with the level and vice versa. You can then obviously finally trim the output at the very end of the stage. If you engage HF on, the unit becomes much more peculiar. So now let's take a look at the single parameters and how they look in the graph. So if I have a preamp off, you see this is 100% linear. There is some gain reduction, sort of like a minus 0.8. So I can go here, maybe and compensate it, and this would be as close to unity gain as possible. If I engage the preamplifier, now we're getting close to unity gain with the output trim exactly at 0. And you see it's no longer linear. So we have the typical low pass at Nyquist. We have kind of a bump around 4 Hertz, something like that. And we have kind of a little bit of a gentle bump all across the spectrum. If we increase the input trim, things start becoming less and less linear, up to the point at which obviously things become incredibly chaotic and, crazy. In the middle part is where the peak limiting happens. So if I were to take this full spectrum and increase the threshold, you see that I'm pumping up gain, but things are actually changing in a very interesting way. There's a high frequency sort of a shelf going on, which isn't actually a shelving factor, but there's definitely some added point towards 20K, and the bump at the 4 Hertz start becoming a little bit more evident. There's also a little bit of a dip right after that. Then you compensate for level, and this becomes way more linear as a sort of an LF, I would call it trim almost. If you engage the HF on, now we have the 2 split bands. So now this is very important. Look at what happens when I move the HF threshold. The signal for the high frequencies turning at the pivot of 1.5 kilohertz is going up, and the lower part, the LF, is going down. So that's the main difference with the single band behavior, because now LF threshold actually controls the single stage of the low frequencies, but the high frequencies actually compensate for the low frequencies. Now, when we move the level of the HF, we're rebalancing the lows as well. So the HF area is very peculiar. I think the engineers meant for this because it's how you really get the mix, or whatever you use this limiter on, to rebalance and get the sound that this unit is able to do it. And that's why it's complicated, I think. That's why a lot of people have issues with it, because they quite expect it to behave in a different way. That's quite not easy to understand just by looking at the interface, that's for sure. So the last element I want to talk about is the bulbs of the SOA overflow. You can have green, yellow, and red. The important thing to know is that green usually means it's okay, yellow means we're approaching clipping, and red means that the unit is incapable of handling the transients being thrown at it. Now, in the way I learned to use this unit, green is all we need, and we can be plenty wrong while still having the lights on the green, just so you know. The last thing is the output trim, which, as we notice, keeps being linear even with all the preamp and HF on engaged. Now, if we throw a 1 kHz sine wave at these plugin at -18, we see that with the pre-engaged, we have quite a lot of harmonic content already. We have a second and third harmonic. If we disengage the pre, things become a lot more linear. Obviously, the harmonics increase with our input trim, and the harmonics go all over the place when we increase the LF threshold. Peak limiting does that, so I would expect things to go this crazy. And obviously, I mean, we already have 2 dBs of peak reduction, and we're clipping in an analog sort of way the waveform, but we're still clipping it. So it's obvious that the limiter creates all sorts of added harmonic content. If we engage HF on and then we turn HF threshold up, we'll still see that there's a little bit more harmonic content being generated, but remember that the crossover point seems to me to be at around 1.5 kilohertz. Our sine would be at 1 kilohertz, so we would need to move it, I would say, to around 5K, and then we see that now the HF band is generating all of those harmonics. If we move it back to 50 hertz, for example, we see that things are linear again because the LF threshold isn't pushing that much. But if we push it, there we go, harmonics are back. So this concludes the technical part, and now that we know how this works on a technical standpoint, let's move to the action. So we're gonna have 3 songs, not one, just to test the behavior of this limiter, and I'm gonna run you through the workflow that I've learned from, trust me, the best. I think after we're done with this, you're gonna feel a lot more confident and then find your own approach to use this plugin. The 3 songs I've picked are a soundtrack, a rock song, and a more singer-songwriter kind of tune. So let's start with the toughest of all. This is the soundtrack part, is a song I wrote for a video game, and I took the no mix bus version. So this is by all means nothing that was heard by anybody. It's the mix bus printed without any of the effects. And when I mixed this song, I actually had a lot of plugins already on the insert. Why did I want to do it that way? Because now we can use this limiter to kind of compensate the problems that this track has in this state. And it's gonna be tough, but it's gonna show you what can be done with this dual stage mode. So let's listen to this track at the final chorus where things are much more energetic, with the plugin turned on as if it was a piece of hardware we had patched in, but without turning any knob at first. All right, so as we noticed before with the graphs, it's not linear, but it sounds quite transparent. So let me walk you through my workflow. The song, the track as it is now with no mix bus on it, sounds too dark. And this is the perfect context in which this plugin can tighten things up, make them sound a bit more expansive, and kind of give detail by grasping at things that are in the actual mix and bringing them, up front in a very kind of elegant but aggressive and modern way too. So what I would do is we keep the pre on because that's what the unit would sound like. I engage the HF on and I'm gonna just move the LF threshold until I see the 0 GR gain reduction line LED just, lighting up. Just the 0 and barely. You wouldn't want to go more than that, trust me. So let's try these first. As you see, I've just barely shaved this LF threshold and we're getting almost nothing, but sometimes there's some louder transients and they're getting corrected, I would say. They don't sound distorted. I think the mix sounds a little bit crispier by definition because we are controlling the LF and we're not touching the HF. But let's keep going. Step number 2 would be to move the HF threshold, not until I see a gain reduction, but until I hear the typical crispiness of this unit. And I might have to move the HF level downwards while I'm going up with the HF threshold. So again, we're not looking for LEDs lighting up in the gain reduction thing. This is the Bible. You don't want to do that because by the time you see a 0 LED lighting up or even a 1, your highs are destroyed. Trust me. So step number 2 is done. I reached a point at which I know that the HF threshold is right there on the verge of sounding too crispy, and I like it. So after step number 2, I know that these two knobs, LF and HF threshold, are at my maximum. That's my limit. And what I learned to do and was taught to do is we're now only backing off from this. The first thing I would do is now I'm going to use the HF level knob to rebalance the lows and the highs. Why is that? Because we notice in the technical part that when I move HF level to the minus part, so counterclockwise, the highs are going down at the crossover, and when I'm going to the positive clockwise, the highs are going up and the lows are going down. So this is actually a great way to rebalance the mix. And when I'm doing this, I might retouch the HF threshold. I might maybe go a notch up or maybe go a notch down, but I'm not gonna touch LF. So let's do this. This could be the end of my workflow. Now, if I had a step 4, I would go to the LF level and threshold and maybe back down again to avoid having that 0. Let's try that. I think it sounds great. With one single unit, we were able to fix the main issue of this track. The fact that it was a little bit boxy, everything was kind of confused together, but the elements, the energy was there. Everything was ready. It just needed, coming up to the front. All right, now for a completely different song. This is a band I co-produced. It's a rock tune, and it's the final mix that the band approved. We're gonna work first and foremost on the loudest part, which is the final chorus, and I'm gonna tune things in, and then we're gonna listen through, just shuffling around the song. So you see here that the mix level is so healthy that I actually have quite of a hard time to get the threshold to go and peak. That's perfectly fine. I don't need to do that. So let's try and see where things rebalance in a way that I kind of like, but I'm still gonna follow my same approach. We're gaining a lot of bass registry back, and it sounds right with, and it sounds processed without. That's a very good sign that the unit does what it's supposed to do. Now let's move to the second step. Okay, now I kind of like it. I like how the snare becomes a little bit more present and detailed, and I like most of all the vocals. That's the HF in songs that have lead vocals is great to kind of add detail and presence and sort of a vibe to the singer, obviously. So now we're gonna do step 3, which is HF level. I kind of feel satisfied this way. I retouched the LF level a little bit. I think it's kind of balanced, and you see how subtle this is now, but this is by no means subtle. There could be a phase 5 where, you know, my mentors would say from there you go 50% less, and then it's gonna be way more than you actually need, because less is more.
So I fall out of the clouds. I wonder why it had to wake me up. I'm not an early bird. You can catch the worm. Whoa. Yeah, yeah. Whoa. Yeah, yeah. Whoa. Yeah, yeah.
I think it's quite subtle, even if we're approaching the 6, you know, sort of on the thresholds. But things are kind of interacting nicely together, and it has a little bit more attitude for a rock song. So if that was what we were looking for from the unit, it's certainly capable of bringing that grit, as I said. So now let's move on to song number 3. This is a quieter, more simple singer-songwriter song. A lot more air, a lot more acoustic instruments. I didn't mix this song. This is the final mix that I got from the band, and let's find a way to use this plugin that can be creative and make things better, as usual with my 4 steps. So let's go to the last chorus, which is usually the loudest part of the song.
Stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along with you. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, but if you wait, I come along. Love happens in its own time. I know that we gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong.
All right, so we are shaving the 0 GR on the lows. Now we move on to the highs and do our usual step 2.
Gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along with you. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, but if you wait, I come along. Love happens in its own time. I know that we gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong.
So I'm gonna back off to the maybe second chorus, and we're gonna back off the threshold for the low frequencies as well. And step 3 and 4 is where things kind of get to blend the whole frequency spectrum in a more musical way. Let's try this.
I got it. I know love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along with you. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along. Yeah. I know love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along with you. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along.
I want to bring up that vibe in the vocal without touching the sort of rhythm section. Let's do that one more time.
Which grows into a garden. I know love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I come along with you. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I'll come along. I know love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I'll come along. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, and if you wait, I'll come along with you. Love happens in its own time. I know that you gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong, but if you wait, I'll come along. Love happens in its own time. I know that we gotta stay true. I know there's a place where you belong.
I think these three examples now made you really understand what this unit does. There's a sort of a perceived clarity in everything this unit touches, and I've gone maybe a little bit more overboard with everything a real mastering engineer would do in a scenario that would involve using this unit. After a convenient coffee break, we're ready for the final part, the way of the loudness, the part in which we try and make things loud AF. And it's a technical term in use, in the last years. Obviously, this original unit that the IVORY5 limiter emulates is an analog peak limiter. I would place it, sometimes if I were to use it for loudness, would be right before the A to D conversion. So I would make sure that this peak limiter absorbs some of the peaks and reduces the dynamic range so that I can move things forward as close as possible to clipping the A to D. Some people might even clip conversion afterwards. Some people say they don't do it, but they still do. In some states, it's almost illegal, but we don't care. Some projects require that. There's a sound coming off to it. Everything is allowed. I just don't care. The purpose of this example, however, is to put things into context. This is a plugin. We are already past the A to D conversion because we are in digital. So there's actually no point in emulating the place and purpose of the original unit. But we can still use these to make things louder, which is different than what I've done until now, which is just tone shaping and sort of like retightening of the whole mix. So let's take this rock mix and let's suppose that the band has listened to the reference and they want things to be louder. So what we do first is we listen to where we are. So we have a meter, we have the plugin turned off, and we just listen to the final chorus, which is where things are the loudest. So we're hitting around minus 16 dB RMS, and we have around a minus 4.4 true peak for the left channel, and there's another dB and 2 to add for the right channel, probably because of inconsistencies with the guitars. The purpose here is not to master this song. Again, it's just to try and get things to be louder. So let's say this is not enough for the band, because minus 16 dB RMS would be fine probably if you get loudness normalized, but let's say that we're approaching a platform where this doesn't happen and we want things to be louder. So the first thing you would do is take a gain knob and go +6. So now you play the third chorus again. So what happened? We have a minus 10 dB RMS, so we're actually 6 dB louder or so, and we are at a 1.6 dB plus. This means that we're clipping 1.6 dB, and this is no good because it's just gonna change things, and it's louder, but it's not working. And this is where this peak limiter comes in. Now let's turn it on, let's remove the gain, and let's start over. So in wideband mode, we would work with the LF threshold until we see some gain reduction, and then we would try and make things louder. At that point, we're sort of holding the peaks down when they're too loud, and this is compressing the dynamic range and allowing us to move upwards, right? So let's try this first in wideband mode as a first solution. So 6 on the LF threshold is the point, the breaking point at which we start getting gain reduction and things start sounding different. We can get away with that 0, but when we reach 12, it's like completely destroyed and obliterated. So what could we do? Well, there's now a way for us to take a look at the meters, take a look at the LF level, and so on and so forth. And let's try and make it not clip in true peak and get a, more energetic RMS level. So we jumped from minus 16.5 to around 8.8. So we made it definitely louder and we're not clipping. We're close to it. We're at minus 0.1. It might be not right for the final medium that you want to use, but we are not over a true peak meter. So that's good. Let's try and bring this to yet another level. Let's try and make it even louder by engaging HF on and then sort of redoing everything. It sounds horrible, right? It is loud, but it's horrible. And we are still getting over 0.8 dB. But I just moved it to a point where I can see both areas, the LF and HF, to have some kind of gain reduction. So I know that the peaks are taken, under control. Now I'm gonna move the HF level to redesign and rebalance the whole mix. Let's try this, and then finally I'm gonna adjust the output just so that I have a final offset to avoid clipping. So we reached around minus 5.6 dB RMS, something like that. Let's say we're close to minus 6 dB, and that's a lot. Does it scare me that it doesn't get any louder? Well, no. It's pretty much really loud already for a single peak limiter that emulates true peak limiting. And trust me, if this was in the analog domain and we would even go further and clip the A to D, you can easily get to minus 4. Easily, with something like a Ivory like I have, or other converters that are more made for loudness. Again, is it healthy? Is it necessary? It depends on a variety of factors, but you can easily get there to the elusive minus 4, which a lot of bad people want to reach. But this to prove that we can take the mix there and still avoid peaking Some bands actually like the splash that the snare gets, and we should do one last comparison. Try and take these, the preset that I called Loud AF and the preset that I called Loud But Legal, and compare them against the original. So I'm gonna take both down to the level that the original had, and we are going to compare without getting fooled by gain. Remember that for as much as I love gain matching, and it's a necessary absolute must for comparisons of different sounding plugins and whatever, this case was not about gain matching because we know the sound's gonna change. So it's more about like how much can I save before hitting utter destruction and still reach incredible loudness with only this device, which never happens to be the case whenever people want to reach that -6, that -4 in a secret but sort of less dangerous way, because mastering for loudness is a completely different thing, and it takes even arranging a song at a different level. But it's a great thing for us to know that this limiter can take such a beating. Now let's do the final comparison, and then we can draw our conclusions ourselves. And there you have it, 3 different loudness levels from original to kind of loud to super kind of loud. I'll let you be the judge, and this concludes our final part. So this concludes my video. I hope you found it useful and made you sort of reconsider this plugin and the real unit if you had already tested it and found it not to be to your liking. It's a unit that has a lot of potential and does something in quite a unique way. So I wouldn't disregard it. I would actually keep it there, especially if you work with a lot of acoustic music. And the beauty is in the subtleties. By the time you see the LEDs lighting up, you might be already considering things to be too much. But this unit is capable of touching your music to a point where it sounds better, more detailed, and just easier to translate to a lot more systems that it would be without this. So I think Acustica did a great job. It's great to have analog peak limiters in the digital domain. Great alternative to the other brick walls. They're different, you're gonna use both, but now you know how to use this. So thank you very much for watching. Ciao.